Hello, welcome back to History of Wine and the Vine. I'm Emily Kate. So this week we're going to be discussing taxation, which goes hand in hand with shipping. So the history of taxation of wine is definitely an interesting one. I think that in general it's important to understand something that we've kind of extrapolated from Diocletian's price edict. So in 1301, Diocletian, an emperor, kind of created something that was aimed at ending price speculation and kind of controlling prices. And although it didn't really work, unfortunately for Diocletian, it gave us a great idea of what prices were kind of supposed to be and how things were supposed to be priced in relation to each other. So if you look at these numbers, it's really great to see because, for instance, you can see that it was 5 times as expensive to transport something via a waterway than it was to transport it via the ocean, or that it was up to 56 times more expensive to transport something on kind of an overland roadway rather than transport it over the ocean. So clearly there was enormous costs involved in transporting things kind of overland routes and using roads and everything like that, and generally people definitely wanted to keep things at overseas shipping. It was actually more expensive to ship something 75 miles inland than it was to ship something across the ocean. Clearly, this definitely shaped things and definitely had a huge impact on the wine industry and how it was created. So what we have to think about is pretty much kind of how do we know this? So essentially in the 5th century BC, all these Roman amphora were stamped on the handles based on which tolls they went through. So we know kind of a lot about the different tolls that they had and the different taxes that were levied. Everywhere kind of did taxes differently, but we know that Emperor Aurelian in the 270s AD actually built a wall around Rome, a brand new wall. And although he claimed that it had dual purpose, that it was also for safety and protection and defense, it was also definitely for taxation because it actually followed the kind of levy boundaries that used to exist around the 1st century BC. So all these different customs that would have been levied in a certain area, he just put a wall there. So you literally could not pass without paying these kinds of taxes and levies. So all of these different kind of ways of taxing the wine really had an impact, as you can imagine, on the geography of wine. So in a lot of places, it just simply did not pay to import wine there because with all the taxes that you would have to incorporate into the price, it was too expensive. So places that wouldn't have normally really have fostered a wine industry actually ended up having wine industries of their own. And then furthermore, I think it's interesting to see, I have a picture here, which I think I've shown you before. It's interesting if you look at images of oceans and seas and waterways, you'll see that, well, for many reasons, but especially for trade, if it's 56 more times expensive to transport if you're not near an ocean, places really gravitated towards rivers, channels, waterways, oceans, and that's part of the reason why Campania was so successful, that if you kind of have the easy access to water, you were definitely more likely to have a vineyard on your land because it was just, you would make so much more money shipping rather than if you had to ship it overland. So everything was kind of taxed differently in different places. So some people taxed based on the quality, some people taxed based on the quantity, and sometimes taxes definitely changed based upon the surrounding kind of political climate. So as an example, in England, maybe at one point you had a ton, which is kind of like a huge wine cask, that might cost 3 British pounds. And then right after that, the 100 Years' War started, and because of all, you had fewer resources at your disposal, you had fewer laborers, and you had to protect the ships that were transporting these tons. for the trade, you had to protect them from seizure and piracy and all kinds of different things. You actually had a over double price increase, and it ended up being in the 1370s, it was actually 8 British pounds per ton. So definitely a huge tax burden that was then put on the people that were buying, and the merchants and kind of the consumers. And in 1330, the British government tried to kind of regulate who was kind of holding this burden of all these heavy taxes that were coming out of the different shipping arrangements that people were making. And it turned out that obviously the merchants were trying to make all of the consumers and the people buying the wine kind of liable for all these taxes, and that wasn't necessarily fair. So the British government actually tried to put forth an edict that said that if a wine had traveled more like 30 miles, you could raise it per gallon 1/2 of a shilling. And if it had traveled 54 miles, you could raise the price 1 shilling per gallon. So you can kind of do it in increments like that and figure out how many shillings you could raise the price of what you were selling, but you couldn't by law raise it more than that. And that was kind of to protect the people against paying for these really heavy taxes. So kind of interesting there. And then you also have, if you go way back to ancient Mesopotamia, we actually have like letters and notes from these toll people, the people that ran the tolls along the rivers. And you actually have all of these things that say they would ask for 10% of the valuation of whatever you were bringing. So in this instance, we're talking about quality, not quantity. And the interesting thing is you could either give them 10% in silver of the valuation of what you were bringing, or you could give them 10% of your wine. So if you forked over 10% of your wine, let's say you had 10 amphora and you just tossed one over to the toll person, you could definitely pass through the river. But as you can see, there's always been a way to tax wine, and there's always been, you know, a bit of a funny business going on. So I hope you enjoyed learning about this, and I will see you next week. Cheers!